Stand by, we'll roll call in a moment here. So we need to be in the Tuesday council meeting link, right?
Yep, friendly reminder, if you can jump into eScribe to the April 6th council meeting, that's where all of the votes and the motions will take place.
Okay, I think I'm in the right place now. Sorry, a lot of moving pieces this morning. Bear with me, please. I'll call us back to order, continuing Tuesday's council meeting. I'm going to just do a quick roll call and then insert a protocol item. I'm sure you'll understand why in a moment. Councillor Knack?
Yes, good morning.
Good morning. Councillor McKean?
Good morning.
Good morning. Councillor Nickel?
Good morning.
Good morning, Councillor Paquette. Councillor Paquette?
Good morning.
Morning. Councillor Walters?
Good morning, and Mr. Mayor, just to let you know, I'll be ducking out from about 10 to 10:30 for a regional transit media thing this morning. Just a heads up.
Understood. Thank you for the heads up. Councillor Banga?
That's your call.
So that's what you call. Councillor Cartmel?
Good morning.
Morning, Councillor Caterina.
Good morning.
Morning, Councillor Zadig.
Good morning.
Morning, Councillor Essinger.
Good morning.
Morning, Councillor Hamilton.
Good morning.
Morning, and Councillor Henderson is usefully here in person. So that's everybody, and I'll have some comments about our agenda in a moment, but I think it's only right to take a moment to pause to express our condolences on the sad news of the death of His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh and consort to Queen Elizabeth II. Prince Philip valued community, duty, and service throughout his life, and he was particularly passionate about celebrating and encouraging service and excellence among young people across the country and around the world. He believed in the power of youth to change the world for the better. His first visit to Edmonton was in 1951 when he joined then Princess Elizabeth on a 33-day-long trip to Canada. He made other visits to Edmonton, including in 1978 to accompany Queen Elizabeth at the opening ceremonies of the Commonwealth Games, as well as in 2005 for Alberta's centennial. Flags at the City of Edmonton buildings will be flown at half-staff starting today to recognize the passing of His Royal Highness Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. And our thoughts are with Her Majesty the Queen, the royal family, and the people of Great Britain at this sad time. Please, a moment of silence. Thank you. So on the matter of our 2.5 hours together, Councillor Henderson and I both have an extremely hard stop at noon, and in fact probably need to leave a couple of minutes before noon just to be online for another event with a number of other mayors. So just a heads up. And we also have potentially more than 2.5 hours worth of work here to do. I am told that the most urgent matters from an administrative perspective are the item 9.3 and
621 that we would like to add, please, Mr. Mayor.
621. 620, okay, so is there anything else to add or just the 621?
Just the 621 is new. There's still a few other reports outstanding.
Okay, and the suggestion is that we make those time-specific first and second item
Please.
so that we can make sure they're dealt with.
And sorry, 9.2 also needs to be directed, or needs to be dealt with because
Right.
there's a meeting coming up that direction needs to be provided.
So I would suggest 621 first because it's public, then 9.2, then 9.3. And that may take the morning. If it doesn't, we'll obviously move into, subject to council's setting those as time specific, we'll move back to the motions pending. There are other issues that arise with respect to the timeliness around the motions pending, but my recommendation based on discussion with administration from an agenda management perspective would be to, once we've added 621, make it first item this morning and make 9.2 and 9.3 second and third item this morning, and then proceed in order after that. So can I get a motion to add 621?
So moved.
Thank you,
Second.
Councillor Etzinger, seconded by Councillor Henderson. And what's the title on that one?
The title is item 621, COVID-19 Pandemic Homelessness Response. It's a council update.
Yeah. Okay, just so we have the name on it then, please vote to add 621.
Councillor Banga, we have all the votes.
Display the vote, please. Carried.
So I'll move to make 6.21 first item and 9.2 second item and 9.3 third item.
Thank you.
Second.
Seconded by Councillor Essinger. Any questions on that? Not seeing any, please vote. Display the vote.
We're
Oh,
waiting for two
sorry.
more. They're just coming through, Mr. Mayor.
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor Zadick. We have all the votes.
Display the vote. Carried. Okay. Well, we'll see how far we get, and around 11:30, I'm going to check in on what we may need to postpone and how to manage the agenda so we don't crunch right into noon. So we'll check in a couple of hours on where we're at. Hopefully it'll go fast and we can get to everything though. And without further ado then, I'll ask administration for the presentation on 621, continuing our good discussion from EAC the other day.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Our delegation for this morning introduced Jackie Ford, our branch manager of social development, and with her is Crystal Kajener, director of housing and homelessness, both online. First, though, just to quickly apologize for this report being late getting to council, but we are, as you're well aware, under some short timeline pressures. So we are here today for two purposes. First, to bring you an update on planning underway to support people who are homeless during the next stages of the pandemic response. And secondly, to recommend funding from the COVID Recovery Fund to be allocated to support the health and well-being of homeless individuals. Next slide then. Just by way of background, the pandemic response over the winter was characterized primarily by the activation of three larger pandemic accommodation shelters, one at Commonwealth Rec Center, one is commonly referred to as the Cesco Building on the south side, and then, as everybody is aware, at the Convention Center. These temporary shelters augmented the existing shelter system by providing up to 530 additional beds on a 24/7 basis. During the time of their operation, Edmonton saw a large surge in COVID-19 cases in the general population and with individuals who are homeless or experiencing housing insecurity. The strain was felt by individuals accessing shelter and staff who continue to put themselves at risk and provide services for individuals in need. The resolve of our homeless serving agency partners was tested every day, and each day they stepped up to the challenge in an unprecedented display of cooperation and coordination, whether it be twice daily bed allocation calls organized by Alberta Health Services or the municipal agencies at Tipanawa working together to cover shifts or respond in setting up temporary isolation units. Through the challenges, the need of the individuals served remained paramount. Outbreaks at shelters limited engagement opportunities, but housing outreach continued and 242 individuals found permanent housing, and the system adjusted to create new bridge housing opportunities, including new spaces at the currently at capacity facility commonly referred to as the jockey dorms. The need for emergency shelter services for those experiencing housing insecurity does continue to grow. The pandemic impacts and uncertainty on the timing of economic recovery continues to take a toll, and there are now nearly 400 more people on the by names list compared to this time last year. On the next slide. Knowing that the 3 temporary shelters would be closing this spring, Administration, Community and Social Services of the Government of Alberta, and Homeward Trust began planning the next phase of the pandemic response based on the learnings of the past year and the threat of the new variants that were emerging. The new approach for our pandemic response sees a transition to a more dispersed model of smaller emergency shelter locations spread out across the city. The model limits the potential for large outbreaks and allows greater customization of service at each location. And to be clear, the Government of Alberta is responsible for ensuring sufficient emergency shelter spaces exist for people experiencing homelessness. So for this spring, summer, and fall, the city's contribution to the provincial responsibility is limited to making the Spectrum facility, also known as the former horse racing track on the exhibition lands, building available to Hope Mission to operate a 24/7 shelter. The nature of accommodation in the response is also changing, with a shift where possible in providing a self-contained unit of accommodation from a traditional emergency shelter bed or mat. This change will provide more privacy and dignity to individuals, provide a natural transition into more long-term forms of housing, and is intended to limit spread in response to COVID-19 variants. Some Government of Alberta funded shelters cannot provide 24/7 spaces, and the loss of the large assembly rooms at Tipanawa will lead to a reduction in day drop-in spaces available. So administration is recommending in our report to bridge this service gap by supporting homeless serving agencies by offering a city building for day usage and financial assistance in the delivery of day drop-in services at 2 existing community facilities. The next slide, a little hard to read on the system here. It's also included as attachment 2 in the report, but it does show the location of homeless serving locations involved in the pandemic response. Transition to smaller locations dispersed model has actually been occurring throughout the last year as the homeless serving system continues to respond to COVID-19. If we were to compare what this map would look like to 3 months ago, you'd see a much smaller number of locations. If you were to go back to this time last year, you would see less than half the number of locations in the initial response to the pandemic. So on the next slide, between May to November of this year, administration is recommending allocating COVID recovery funds to subsidize expanded services at 3 day drop-in locations. Physical distancing requirements have severely limited places for those experiencing housing security to meet their most basic needs, whether it's in respite from the weather, hygiene amenities, or access to food and water. Many homeless serving agencies have seen capacity at their locations shrink considerably and have experienced significant fundraising shortfalls. To ensure that individuals' most basic needs are met and to ensure that those in need of assistance can get that assistance as opposed to wandering the streets, administration is looking to directly support day drop-in spaces. There are 3 locations that we're proposing would be a temporary new day-use drop-in facility in a city-owned building at 10542 105th Street. Secondly, would be expansion would be to expand hours and activate the outdoor courtyard at Boyle Street Community Services. And thirdly, facility would open day drop-in spaces and extended hours at the Bissell Center. So those are the 3 facilities that we're bringing to council for proposed funding today. The next slide then. COVID recovery means many things to many people, and it cannot be deemed successful if it does not ensure opportunity for recovery to all people. This applies to individuals who may be accessing shelter services, neighborhoods, and businesses. Helping meet the needs of homeless individuals is complementary to downtown recovery efforts, and in ensuring those suffering from addiction or mental health issues receive help will reduce their victimization and social disorder that may follow. The locations supported by the City of Edmonton will have community safety and security plans developed in partnership with the operator and EPS, including the Good Neighbor agreements. These safety and security plans have been implemented at other shelter and temporary pandemic locations over the past year, and we will take lessons learned to be applied in each of these individual locations. The Good Neighbor agreements will include key contact information and will be provided to neighbors around the location and posted online. As part of our recommendation this morning, administration is also proposing a temporary investment in gender-neutral, barrier-free public washrooms. Mobile washrooms will be placed in up to 6 locations where temporary shelters are in close proximity to business areas and in the downtown. The final location and hours of service will be determined in consultation with the Business Improvement Area Council. These 6 temporary washroom facilities in business areas will include attendants, in addition to an attendant who will be situated at the permanent washroom location at Tix on the Square. These temporary washrooms in the downtown are a component of our downtown action plan aiding economic recovery. As well, the temporary investment in these washroom facilities will help administration better understand the longer-term capacity need for these amenities as indicated in one of the recommendations of the Community Safety and Wellbeing Task Force, which Council heard from earlier this week. So on the next slide, this slide is included in our deck really to provide a bit of a high-level picture of the overnight services in Edmonton from a systems perspective. Government of Alberta, Homeward Trust, and non-profit agencies are all playing important roles in responding to the challenges of the pandemic and supporting recovery efforts. Emergency overnight shelter is primarily funded by the Government of Alberta, and with the closure of Tipinawa, the city is now exiting the direct funding of that service, but are still contributing through the usage of the Spectrum building. Since the onset of the pandemic and until late summer, early this fall, the Government of Alberta is providing and will be providing funding of over $24 million in Edmonton. These funds are dedicated to open additional shelter spaces to meet physical distancing requirements and enable shelter to transition to 24/7, also to provide shelter operation support, and then finally to activate isolation spaces for individuals experiencing homelessness who are mandated to isolate due to a COVID-19 diagnosis or a confirmed close contact, and make service delivery adjustments in short-term, long-term supportive housing facilities to meet public health protocols. Homeward Trust also has stepped up to fund additional short-term supportive and bridge housing at the jockey dorms, as I mentioned, and a number of hotels within the city. These activations are often done in partnership with agency operators, including Jasper Place Wellness, Boyle Street Services, and Youth Empowerment Support Services. Administration is recommending to fund day programming around the downtown core to ensure individuals who currently cannot access services elsewhere or need familiar support can have access to these supports. Each service offering is complementary to the other and collectively form a network of support, bridging the current COVID-19 gap. So the chart on this slide shows the estimated cost breakdown of the administration's funding recommendation. Total cost, as shown on the slide and in the report, is $8.1 million. The day programming costs are inclusive of location setup, staffing, meals, and support services. They are still under final refinement, and we are continuing to explore opportunities to leverage funding from the social agencies and other partners. If the funding recommendation by council today is approved, administration will confirm an operator for the 105th and 105th building, prepare funding agreements with nonprofit agencies, and will return to City Council to seek applicable agreement approvals in the coming weeks. The Spectrum Building has had services turned off in the building for a number of years. There are some costs associated to turning back on the building. The majority of these costs we expect will be passed along to the operator, but there may be some unforeseen costs. Any surplus costs that may occur from turning back on the building will then be held for off-site supports, whether that be additional litter cleanup, graffiti removal, or other minor maintenance. On the next slide, while not included in our written report, our written council report, I did want to communicate to council our encampment approach for this year. Administration is working with partners to develop a coordinated approach to reduce the negative impacts of individuals and communities relating to encampments with the following two goals. First, prevent large-scale encampments from being established, and secondly, coordinate the closure of encampments with clear and consistent connections to shelter and housing options as possible. City of Edmonton responds to encampments through a four-step process: assessment, prioritization, respond, and then cleanup. This year, the prioritization step will use an updated risk assessment tool to prioritize encampments for closure and an augmented assessment process to address encampments proactively. The assessment tool includes the size of camps against established thresholds, the severity of risks present, including consideration of fires and biohazard waste, proximity to schools, whether they are occupied or unoccupied, and whether it is within a neighborhood significantly impacted by encampments in previous years. Depending on the risk assessment, response and cleanup will be scheduled with different timeframes. So for high-risk encampments, may be enforced as quickly as within 24-hour period, pending availability of resources between our peace officers and Edmonton Police Services. For moderate risk encampments, will be presented with an immediate closure notice to encourage voluntary compliance. However, enforced closure may take up to 26 days, depending on the severity of risks, availability of resources, and advice from outreach workers actively engaged with camp occupants. And then thirdly, low-risk encampment response is mainly driven by resource availability, as available resources are prioritized to high and medium-risk locations. Peace officers and outreach workers will continue to engage with the encampment, seeking voluntary compliance and assess risks on the site to determine whether it needs to be reprioritized. Encampment enforcement requires an empathetic approach, aided by our social agency outreach partners. Also, to be successful, it requires alternative locations for individuals sleeping rough to access services, whether it be a welcoming overnight shelter, day drop-in supports, or the preferred alternative of permanent supportive housing. The city will continue to work with partners on ensuring these landing spots are available to meet people's needs through the spring and summer months and into the future. And to our final slide then. Administration's role over the next 6 months is bridging a gap brought on by the pandemic. In November, we'll see the new Herb Jameson open, and we expect that a large amount of the general public and those experiencing homelessness will be vaccinated. At this time, we expect Alberta Health Services, their health guidelines may be relaxed within shelter settings, allowing capacity at facilities to be comparable to pre-pandemic levels. At this time, the city will no longer financially support overnight or day drop-in services. Although only involved directly in funding and operating homelessness services for a short time, the impact of the city has had on the system will be felt for some time. The changes the homeless serving system has already experienced over the past year have been significant. We expect over the next 6 months that city involvement will further advance the system to be more connected, providing more options for those in need of service, and more mature in how it responds to crises and opportunities. Our continuing involvement will better inform potential shelter standards and the real-world applicability of regulations. And to that end, our city manager is having ongoing conversations with the Deputy Minister of Community and Social Services around shelter standards and the minimum shelter standard motion made by council. Most of all, though, the work we undertake is in the hope of keeping people safe and to instill within our vulnerable population and all Edmontonians that everyone has worth and that we are all in this together. Concludes the presentation, Mr. Mayor. We can go to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Smythe. Questions? Councillor McKean?
Thank you. The Spectrum building, remind me, I'm not as sharp as I should be this morning, but is that on the Northland site?
That's correct, Councillor. It's the whole old facility people would watch the horse races in.
How many beds, how many spaces will there be in that site for shelter?
At this point, we're planning with the GOA to have 150 beds there, but there is space that if demand escalated, we could go beyond that.
Would you look at all, Mr. Smythe, at other facilities around the city? I won't speak for Councillor Katarina, but I know that downtown is done. We're damned if we do or damned if we don't on this whole situation, and I'm frankly nearly done. So we want an empathetic response, absolutely, and I think my credentials on that speak for themselves about advocating for the homeless. But I think we have to have empathy for the communities and businesses that are impacted by the side effects. And tell me, does this plan of yours include more sophisticated security for the nearby folks?
Thanks for the question, Councillor. We did, just to your first point, we did cast a very wide net in terms of what other buildings would be potentially to be stood up. And these ones with, reviewing them against some criteria were the ones that rose to the top. So we did do a fairly rigorous process to land on our recommendations today. And your point around the impact on community, certainly well aware of the challenges these facilities do have. I think our learnings from the ones that have been stood up over the past year have taught us a lot. And we're certainly well aware of the importance of the good neighbor plans, and we'll be working hand in glove with the organizations to develop those plans, to reach out to community, to have contact information, and to make sure that, there is no impact or impact is minimized absolutely in the surrounding communities. It's an ongoing challenge. Can't guarantee there'll be none, but certainly best efforts of all involved. And I think our work with EPS as well, we've done a lot of connection with frontline staff there, will help to mitigate that challenge.
Okay, yeah, because the encampment process is another one where empathy is stressed, but communications with nearby residents has to be stressed as well. Rossdale and Riverdale in Ward 6 are particularly sensitive, for good reason, about a return to camping in Dawson Park or a return of a large encampment near Rossdale. So, and we get a lot of email about this all the time, Mr. Smythe. So tell me, please, that we're going to communicate well, too.
Yeah, point taken, Councillor. Yeah, the outreach to community will be a work in progress, and we'll certainly pursue that. But I think with our way we can triage the camps with the high risk, moderate risk, and low risk encampments, and our response will vary based on that assessment that we can.
I can't accept it as a work in progress. I need communications with the nearby communities to be a priority.
No, fair enough. It will be.
Okay. And back to the downtown for a minute. I know, Mr. Corbold, you've been meeting with some folks downtown, and I think several of you are going to present at the Downtown Recovery Task Force. But I got to tell you, I've heard recently of businesses, offices wanting to move out of the downtown for a sense of a lack of safety and cleanliness. And can you please tell me that that's a priority too in the coming days and months?
Yeah, certainly, Councillor McKean. It's a high priority. I've been meeting with a lot of those organizations in several different opportunities. Recently met this week from some high-level business leaders as well, who all agreed that that was the number one thing that the City of Edmonton could do. And these are people that have businesses all over the city that have been telling us number one is clean up downtown. We've started the cleanup of downtown. I took a walk myself yesterday, and it is looking better. We are doing a lot of work in back alleys. The city is taking on the responsibility of that on a daily basis right now, just to make sure things are spruced up, the signage. And we're also working, and I will chat with anybody in the downtown core who wants to talk about specific problems. I've highlighted to council also that with the change in our security operator with Corps of Commissioners having taken over on the 1st of April, they are taking a different approach in terms of how they connect with downtown businesses and other security, private security entities in the downtown core. So there's more of a connection and a team approach to observation and watching what's going on, and of course ongoing collaboration with EPS, who are absolutely important to this. This is something that we're looking at every day and meeting on, and we'll just have to take a continual improvement approach to it. And then finally, I would say that I met last night for a couple of hours with all the festival organizers, and we talked about this point as well, and talked about the specific things we can do to make sure, in particular, the downtown festivals can take place subject to COVID restrictions. And they're all keen to do that, and so we're working on proactively putting those pieces in place.
Thank you. I'm out of time. I might come around again, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Henderson?
Well, I have a slight proactive worry for the south side, based on Councillor McKean's experiences, because I'm looking at the kind of cluster of shelters that will be put in around the core of the Old Strathcona White Avenue area, which is fine. I don't have a problem with that. My worry is they're not 24/7, and that we have absolutely no 24/7 support on the south side, and that seems to me as a real recipe for trouble. So I'm guessing they're not, because Neighborhood Center, I'm assuming, isn't reopening for drop-in. And I worry that we have, that I certainly understand the need for the shelter. I understand those facilities and why, they're available. But to have those as evening only, nighttime without any daytime support over there, it seems to me is a recipe for just transporting the kind of problems we've had downtown. So thoughts about that?
Yeah, we're aware of that issue, Councillor. The information that I have is maybe we can have Jackie or Crystal weigh in, is that a couple of the churches are 24/7.
Okay.
That Mustard Seed is standing up. I believe Strathcona and Knox, and perhaps the Moravian one as well.
Okay.
But maybe we could just ask Jackie or Crystal to
Yeah,
weigh in on.
I think the Moravian one is a little bit separated, so I think it's but the Strathcona and Knox are literally right across the street from each other in the very core. And if we don't have a way to support people during the day there, I would be worried about it.
Councillor Henderson, Crystal General, just supplement with the information Mr. Smith provided. All of the facilities are 24/7 with the exception of the Trinity Lutheran Church. And I know that Mustard Seed is working with the church to see if they can institute some day sleeping there. So it wouldn't be 24/7, but at least it would provide additional spaces for day sleep specifically. So that's another piece that they're working through. And then also, just so you're aware, The BIA in the area and Mustard Seed have been in conversations, and Mustard Seed will be also including 2 outreach ambassador positions, funding that as part of this work, so that they can be active in the community and encouraging folks to connect to those 24/7 and daytime supports as much as possible.
Yeah, great. I mean, I know a lot of that community's there, so that's good to hear. You know, I don't think it's, I mean, obviously, Oscarthon has been used to dealing with you know, this joint use for quite a number of years. I just was really worried that we were going to have people that were going to be put out onto the street in the morning with nowhere to go, and that seems to me really problematic. So that won't be the case?
It won't be the case in any of the venues except for one, and hopefully we're trying to work through a solution currently, so that it's not the
Yeah,
case.
I think Trinity Lutheran is a little bit further away in historic. That's not a new use. That's been an historic use. So I think that although that historic use was connected into the neighborhood center itself, which I'm presuming isn't reopening, is that a fair assumption?
No, the neighborhood center or the neighborhood center will be open as part of this activation
Okay,
as well.
great.
Yeah,
Okay, well,
it'll
that
be
helps.
available for daytime support.
Great, okay, that, because they weren't last summer, so that's good to hear. And then my one other question then is around the washroom piece, only because of our experience with the White Avenue washrooms is, you know, they worked really well for a while, then they were definitely not working. And it wasn't until we put regular attendance back in there that they've turned back into a real success story. Now, understanding that comes with a cost, there were some advantages too. We were able to give some work to some people that I think, you know, for whom it was an advantage to have work. I think it's, but is that what we're thinking about as we go into washrooms elsewhere? Because I think we know how well that worked, albeit it does add a bit of cost.
Agreed, Councillor, and that will get scoped into our when we execute on, you know, if Council approves that funding, that will be scoped into our activation.
Great, good, great.
And I'll just add to that, Councillor, we have other washroom-specific needs coming on the 19th of April, in addition to what the ones that are incorporated into this. So we'll be talking more about those facilities.
Yeah, it just was, you know, it was very intentionally designed, that facility, and we still learned that it didn't take care of itself. But once we were able to put people there, my understanding is it's been working really well again, so. And serves everybody, which was its intent.
That's certainly the feedback we've gotten as well.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Knack?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for the information. So based on the by name list and the number of people on the by name list, I want to make sure I'm correct. It would, if I'm doing my math right, it would suggest to me that the provincial government's currently about 500 overnight beds short to address the current number of people who are on that list. Is my math right? It's about 1,600 spaces noted in the presentation, 2,100 people on the by name list.
That's correct. Chris, do you want to elaborate on the by names list a little bit in terms of who's on the list?
Sure. So the by names list currently is sitting just around 2,100 people, and the majority of those folks, about 60%, would be provisionally accommodated, which means that they may be accessing short-term supportive housing, or they're couch surfing with a friend, or possibly they're in a precarious housing situation where they may not have a specific individual tenancy agreement, but they do have housing, but we would consider them to be effectively homeless because they don't have they're not secure in that housing. And yes, so a large proportion of the list would be accessing some form of short-term housing at the moment.
Okay. That's helpful. And so I know we've said as a city, we're going to try to do everything we can, recognizing that ultimately it's the provincial government's needing to step up. Attachment 2 shares that list of locations. And so I do want to ask, I mean, you know, besides one temporary hotel location, there's nothing in Ward 1. There's nothing in most of the wards beyond sort of the core areas. And I'm just wondering how we can help the province, maybe with sites that we have in the rest of our city, so that we do not continue to over-concentrate in any one space, but particularly our downtown and south side cores. So are there not opportunities for us to use buildings that we own in the rest of the city, including areas, and I will be the first to say we should have something in the West End?
Certainly, we're working with the government on that exact point, Councillor. But, you know, with the work that Homeward Trust has done in terms of potentially activating some hotels, number of them are not in the core. So we're truly, you know, that's in play as we speak.
What about, sorry to cut you off, what about schools? I'm trying to think of everything that, all sorts of things that we might not normally use, but, you know, I think there's going to be, you know, there's schools that are closed down right now, but that haven't been turned over to anyone else that can be used. Are there buildings that exist right now that we can try to help sort of spread out the need to make sure people have access to all parts of the city?
You know, Councillor, the challenge we had was the time frame to do this work. And we did explore at least one school, and I talked to the superintendent a couple of times about a particular school, and over time that got sort of demoted and not prioritized. So that was in play. Talked to the government of Alberta about potential post-secondary facilities. So there was lots of connection about what else could be in play, and the time frame of spring, summer, fall of this year, you know, was a factor. What could we activate sort of that quickly? Over the long term, certainly we can look beyond this in terms of some permanent facilities beyond the core.
Okay. The last question I have, at least for this round, one of the things I do worry about, I know during the winter why we had to spend the money that we did on temporary shelters or accommodation space like we had at Tifinawa. When I do look at that budget slide that says we're going to spend $7.3 million on setting up a daytime drop-in space to be used essentially through to November, I do feel like I need to ask the question, you know, how much modular housing could be built in the next 5 months across the city with $7.3 million, which would give people permanent homes versus simply providing an additional day drop-in space. You know, I know we've talked about modular housing. I know we have companies here in the city that have done modular housing in BC, and that can be quick and that can be set up on, you know, whether it's a city-owned parking lot. Like, I'm just trying to think of, is the best use of our money providing 6 months of daytime drop-in space, or is the best use of $7.3 million taking a few extra months and building permanent housing options across the city?
Hard question to answer, Councillor, but basically this is a COVID response, very much trying to keep these individuals safe and provide them the right kind of services. So it is a very short-term emergency kind of response, but point taken in terms of the long term, and those 5 facilities that are in play go where you're going. But we believe that because of the emergency nature of this, that this was the appropriate response, albeit short-term and no long-term legacy from this bend. So, I know, Crystal, anything else to add on to that one?
I guess the only other thing that I would add is, Councillor Knack, we are mostly working with one-time funding sources that are time-limited in nature. And anytime we're building, you know, an ongoing permanent housing solution, especially supportive housing, it requires that ongoing source of funding. So we are working within the means that we have. The other piece, though, that I think is important to highlight is there are currently 350 bridge housing spaces that have been open since the pandemic. And we also our Homeward Trust is working with operators to open another 200 in the next few days, or in the next few months rather, or weeks, I guess would be more appropriate. And so between those, we are trying to provide people with those closer connections to housing so that they can, you know, get immediately brought inside and then work on permanent housing. So that when the end of the pandemic comes around, we have housed a lot more folks and connected them to the resources. So we are definitely mindful of the need to always be linking back to permanent housing as the ultimate solution while we try to meet needs in the interim.
Yeah, and I would just add, Councillor Knack, that I think the answer to that question will always be absolutely more permanent actual housing, and modular housing would always be a better use of funds. But the reality is, as long as we have people that need these day spaces, I think we have to provide them. And particularly, you know, in this case, we don't even have 2 months because of the urgent need that we have, and certainly the sort of focused and highly concurrent need from the business community to make sure that we have a good transition strategy here and for neighborhoods as well. So, I mean, I would always answer that question with, yes, modular housing or permanent housing is always going to be better, but as long as we have people that need these facilities, we're going to have some element of this for sure.
Appreciate that. I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Banga?
Thank you. Just your take on different locations. When we keep moving those locations around, every time we invest more money into getting the place ready for these shelters. But the issue is, are we not just displacing the problem from one place to another? Every time we do that, and that money that is invested in getting the place prepared for that is just going down to the waste?
Well, Council, if you take the long view of our response to the pandemic, initially we stood up facilities at Central Line Senior Center and also at Kinsman Sports Center, not having any sense of how long the pandemic would last for. And obviously it's going way longer than we had initially thought it would. So we tried to step up in terms of, rec centers aren't able to be open, so there's some opportunities there. And then as the situation changed, we look for additional change of space. But Council, at the end of the day, the fit-up costs, while there are some costs, we're absolutely trying to minimize them in every venue where we work with the GOA and community agencies to activate. So it's not a significant portion of the expenditure. So everything has been on a temporary kind of basis. The challenge we have as a city is the new facility that's being built downtown that Hope will be operating. That facility closed, and so our capacity in the system shrunk, and then at the same time the requirements for distancing in the facilities increased. So our capacity was very much challenged. So we had to activate these spaces. I mean, ideally, it would have been great to activate one building and use that for the past over 12 months and keep it going, but that obviously didn't materialize.
Okay, and this $8.1 million that we're going to be spending, this is again going to be for how long are we talking about?
We're talking till approximately November, Councillor, and maybe October. So that's that period of time. And you've got to recognize as well, I mean, this is the staffing costs, the support services, nutrition, meals, shower facilities. So it's providing the kind of supports these individuals require.
Okay, let's talk about staffing, meals, and other supplies that come along with it. Some of these individuals, they were, I guess they were either on some kind of social assistance age or some kind of income support. Now, on top of that, we are also feeding them, we're giving them, I mean, nobody wants to go in there, but people who did, we're feeding them, we're basically providing them all the facilities without any work being done by them, cook, clean, whatever else maybe. How could you be able to tell me irrational that why would somebody want to come off this thing if they were in there?
Councillor, really, the social workers and outreach workers that work with these individuals, I mean, these individuals are not getting a free ride, so to speak, which I kind of pick up a little bit. There are expectations by community organizations that they do move along the continuum into bridge housing and into permanent housing. And this is just not an easy route for these individuals. And a lot of them have mental health issues and addiction issues. So they're certainly very much working with their outreach worker to that more permanent solution, and to treat them with the kind of dignity that I think everybody expects them to be treated with, is important. So again, there are expectations in the agencies that they do some work to move down that continuum of getting back to good health. Jackie, Crystal, do you want to elaborate on that?
Sure, Mr. Smythe. So Councillor Banga, folks receiving income support in Alberta, whether it's age rate or through Alberta Supports, it ranges between like from $500 a month up to $1,200 a month. And although Alberta has some of the most generous benefits in the country, it's not enough to always afford the cost of living in our city. And so that's why we find that we have a number of people who continue to access these types of supports, despite the fact that they're in large congregate facilities, that they're maybe not always convenient or accessible, is because they really have no other alternatives, and that's why they're accessing the supports there.
Thank you. I'll come back for a second round.
Thank you. Councillor Nicol.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. And today I'm going to ask some very hard questions. For example, what are these good neighbor agreements going to do? So as Councillor McKeon stated earlier, the downtown core is done. And I'm going to be quite frank, the businesses that I represent on White Ave are done. So I did what I always do. I asked them to record an incident log with regards to what has been happening to just one business. This is just the one business that has to deal with the situation with regards to the homeless population and the shelter population that's around it. So let me read it to you. So on the 15th of February, guy tried to rob the store. On 12th of March, the supervisor was attacked. On March 22nd, lady jumped on the table and was screaming at customers. March 22nd, drug overdose, yelling at kids. March 23rd, went to the washroom and slept for 5 hours. Back on March 22nd, a lady yelling at a customer, asking for food, not paying, making a mess everywhere, throwing things at the customers.
Point of order, is there a question?
I'm reading my incident log through Aaron Paquette. So if you don't want to face the hard reality of what's happening on the street,
Councillor Nicol,
that's your choice.
there's a point of order that's been raised. The question is, do you have a question? You said you were reading a log.
I asked my question at the beginning, Mr. Mayor, about the good neighbor policy and what it's actually going to do.
Okay, Mr.
And these are the type of incidents that I think the good neighbor policy have to address.
I understand your point.
So to continue on.
I understand your
Homeless
point.
person panhandling and yelling at employees. March 28th, guy taking drug overdosing on the property. Whether or not we want to face the ugliness of the situation with this council, I refuse to ignore it. So I will put the question to administration. What will a good neighbor policy do? And what are we doing about enforcing the quality of life laws so people can actually conduct their business and affairs?
Councillor, the good neighbor, at the core of the good neighbor agreement, it's to build a relationship between the facility operator and the community. So how do they work together to provide the services, to create a healthy facility, but then a healthy neighborhood as well? And so it's just to connect. These cannot be, we know these facilities cannot be parachuted in without any kind of connection to community. So building that relationship between the facility operator and the people in the community is what these agreements are about. Who do you call when there's an issue? How do you get to know these people as individuals? And the agency operators have the skill sets to deal with these individuals. And some of them do then go down a continuum where it can become criminalized, and then Edmonton Police have to respond. So it's not going to be a perfect answer, but it's certainly, I think we've moved the dial in terms of those relationships between the operators and community to create the kind of healthy neighborhoods we all want. And certainly recognize that business owners are challenged to provide good businesses, but having those kind of individuals impacting their operation is a thing.
Mr. Smythe and Mr. Corbould, to be perfectly blunt about this, I cannot imagine what Councillor McKeon is going through. I just have one strip on White Ave. And so my sympathies to Councilor McKean, and I'm asking a very, very aggressive question. I have no question about it. But when I see people in the downtown core smoking meth in front of an LRT station and nothing seems to be happening, I got to ask the question, where are these quality of life laws being enforced? And if they're not being enforced, why?
Councillor, we do have, certainly recognize that there are these issues of social disorder. There's no question. We have been, again, working with our colleagues at EPS, with our peace officers to address those kinds of issues you're raising. And we have, the wheels are already in motion. The peace officers are doing more patrols. There's more integration in terms of how we dispatch frontline officers.
Let me finish these last two questions because I'm mindful of the time. Are we doing any extra resourcing for park rangers, number one, that have to deal with the homeless camps in the River Valley? And number two, what's the inventory that's closing down and what's reopening in terms of the facilities that we're funding?
On the park ranger point, Councillor, our ability, we're not going to increase the number of FTEs in our park ranger portfolio, but we do have the ability then to move over temporarily other officers who work in Mr. Aiken's branch. So we'll escalate where there is demand, which we've done in the past. And then the second question is around which facilities are closing. Am I clear on that question?
Yes, because for example, Cesco is shutting down and reopening it. So what is the net?
It'll need to be a second round. Councillor Cartmell. Councillor Cartmell, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mayor Iveson. So just a couple of questions. First of all, just on the Spectrum building, I apologize if I heard this incorrectly, but I understood you to say there'd be about 150 overnight spots in that building. Is that correct?
That's correct, Councillor.
I'm sorry, I don't remember what conversation it was earlier this week or the week before, but I thought I understood a comment to be made that when we get that many people in one space, it becomes hard to manage. And that we start to lose accountability. We start to get a proportion of attendees that take advantage of the others. And that combination of circumstances it borders on amnesty for those that are really driven to do nasty things to the others, if I can say it that way. Just your thoughts around that. 150 and growing seems like a big number, Mr. Spike.
Yeah, point taken, Councillor. I think that is true. Smaller is better as we move down this path. We were limited in terms of what facilities we could activate, and then the capacity of the agencies to actually operate. So it is certainly on the larger scale, but as we kind of work through this over time, trying to activate smaller venues is ideal. Again, we were hamstrung by the options that we had in front of us and trying to activate something as quick as we could. Certainly the convention center facility at 300 was challenging. 150 is, you're right, is on the larger side, but again, trying to balance what's available with what the capacity is was walking a fine line.
And the economy of scale of managing that with available resources, I guess.
That's correct.
Yeah. So thank you for that. With respect to camps, I want to kind of circle back to a question I sort of asked on Wednesday. I appreciate what we're trying to do here. Offer more daytime spaces, offer more spaces generally, offer more spaces in various places. But is there not going to be an inclination to be outside and to live rough despite all of these efforts? And I wonder if part of that encampment strategy might be designated places to camp, designated camping sites. Not sure where they would be, but starting from a conceptual place, camps that are operated more or less like shelters with a bit of registry, with a bit of accountability, with a bit of process, I guess. Would that be, starting from a conceptual place, would that be something that we should contemplate? That rather than trying to push camps out to other places, we pull camps in to places that we can control?
Jackie or Crystal, do you want to weigh in on that one?
Thank you, Councillor. It's Jackie here. We have studied other jurisdictions that have had what we would call like sanctioned encampments, and there have been short and long-term issues with them. It's not something we've taken right off the table, but there is a point in time where they become not as viable as one would think at the beginning. So there are high resource needs. The location is important. So it's not a perfect solution, but it is one that we have considered. We just haven't landed on it yet.
And I would just like to add, Councillor Cartmel, that I was talking to Chief McPhee about this this week, in fact, and so it is on the table from my perspective. But as Ms. Ford mentioned, it's a complicated thing that has to be considered, and it's about finding the right place. And of course, there's impacts with every neighborhood that's got a house close to some of those locations. So this is on our list of things to consider. Absolutely, it's just we're not ready today to put it to council in terms of how specifically it would work out. We couldn't answer the questions about the mechanics of it, but it is absolutely on our list.
So thank you for that. I appreciate those responses. When might we hear back then on that? Do you have a timeline? I'm not trying to put you under pressure, just curious.
Well, I'm trying, and Chief McPhee and I spoke about this, and we're trying to, consider it for this summer. So I think we would have to be able to come back to you within a month about, at the latest, whether it's a viable option for this season.
I'm wondering about the end of April, Mr. Corbell, just simply because, and maybe this is more gut feel than anything, but it feels like that when the convention center ceases operations, that will be the entry point to camps, and that if we're trying to manage that ahead of time as opposed to react to it after the fact, that might be easier.
Yeah, we'll try, and I would say that I don't think this is something we've tried yet. It may not work, but I do think it's worth a try at some point. It's just very complicated, and I just want to make sure everybody understands that.
Agreed in all respects. It's complicated, and maybe it's worth a try. Thank you.
And the next speaker, we're just refreshing the system, is Councillor Caterina, followed by Councillor Paquette.
Councillor Caterina, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I'm not sure where to start here, obviously, but I need one clarification. Commonwealth is being stood down?
That's correct, Councillor.
Because I don't think you had mentioned that in the presentation, that facility will be stood down, and the Spectrum will be stood up, which is virtually in the same location. So with the compounding effects, and I think, we've touched on all this, certainly many areas are done with where it's just over the top at this point. We've been in that situation in around that area for the last 15 years. The efforts that went into the revitalization of Alberta Avenue, Beverly, and Fort Road was to mitigate all these things. And then we stood up the Expo Center with nothing but problems on social disorder, that many promises were made by your department, EPS, and everybody else involved, that they would handle this situation because it's not new. It's not something unknown that you shouldn't have a plan for in place right now. And the Spectrum, just to put it into context, is across the street from Borden Park, which now has to deal with the encampments, which is right across the street from the River Valley, which has to deal with more of the encampments that we've dealt with for decades, regardless of the facilities open and that. So with not just a good neighbor agreement, and this, it doesn't make any sense to me anymore to get the operator to talk in dialogue with a couple of people in the neighborhood and explain what they're going to do. We've already had examples at the Forum Inn where the operator cannot control that population, which is next door to this facility as well. The jockey quarters in the same site. The plans for exhibition lands on redevelopment, certainly this is a hindrance to it and basically sterilizes that area for many more years to come in the efforts to redevelop. So there are a lot of sort of moving parts here, and to put it into context, I think we're at this point that we're using the pandemic as now it's rushed. We don't know what to do, and we have to do something immediate, and might not be the best thing. We've had homelessness in the city for years.
Councillor, have you got a question?
There's got to be a better answer than we're working on. And this includes downtown, areas to the north,
Councillor,
and in general surrounding the river valley. So,
have you got a question?
Mr. Smythe, yeah, Mr. Smythe, I mean, is this, we're working on it and we don't have a clear idea of how to put together a good neighbor plan, what it means, who's responsible for what, the clients, are they responsible for anything, or they can do whatever the heck they want?
Well, Councillor, keep in mind as well, I mean, this is a 6-month strategy here. And then the spectrum will be closed down, basically.
Yeah, whether it's a Spectrum or Commonwealth or the Convention Center or anywhere else in that, I'll speak to the one going on 105th and 105th. Do you think that you know, with Councillor McKean's comments and what he's had to put up with and the concentration there, that another one there is appropriate? That's not going to cause even more problems and pressure on the system?
I mean, I hear you, Councillor, absolutely. I mean, it's our job to try to balance the needs of responding to the needs of these individuals we're trying to serve and minimizing impact on community. So it's a
you haven't shown the minimization on the community, and the Expo Center was a perfect example that whatever happened there, you still have no plan for mitigation at the Spectrum. It's going to happen, and you're going to get the same results at the end of the day. So I would have thought that at this point, we would have had better plan in place for that mitigation for everybody else in the community.
Well, I think we have learned, Councillor, and I think the experience at Commonwealth has been more on the positive side than the negative side in terms of the outreach that Hope has done there. I haven't had any reports or major reports about major incidences from standing up that particular facility. The one that was activated at Kinsman as well, there was some disorder in the playground a little bit, but so I think
again,
we can
in the context, you had the problems at Expo Center, and that's the one I'm talking about. So, you know, you had the problems at the Expo Center. You're well aware of what can happen. How close proximity they are to the community, no buffers in between. So I would think at this point that there would be a plan in place to mitigate those same concerns that actually happened there on that site.
No, certainly the Expo Center, when it had its challenges, there's no question. The scale of that facility.
That's putting it mildly, Mr. Smythe. I mean, let's get realistic here. Using wordsmithing to mitigate things is not appropriate. Things were really, really bad for many people in the area.
Councillor Caterina,
they were really bad.
Councillor Caterina, the clerks have advised me that we're well over 5 minutes. The system reset, so we lost the clock.
That's fine. I don't have a clock in front of me here since my name seems to be dropping off the speaking list every time I go on it.
Okay, I'll flag that for clerks.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Councillor Paquette. We're resetting the system and we're running the clock here, so please watch the comments for the next speaker and the timer, please.
Okay, thanks. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I was just setting a timer here as well. Okay. So, thank you for all of this work. I imagine it's equally as frustrating for you as it is for everyone. And I guess my first question would be, do you have all the tools you need?
Thanks for the question, Councillor. I mean, I mean, the challenge we have certainly is working with all of the players in this space. But I think we're well on our way. I mean, this problem, as a number of councillors have mentioned, has been with us for a long time. And then the pandemic is the crisis that we're facing. So it is, we have to respond and quickly. And that's what's driving this work. The work that council has quarterbacked and led in terms of the long-term solutions, in terms of permanent supportive housing. I mean, those things are in place, but this is a very short-term, crisis-based approach to dealing with the situation that we're facing. So I think if council approves our recommendations, we're well on our way, and it won't be a ideal panacea that's going to solve every problem, but it is certainly going to help this community, help these individuals that we're supporting here, and at the same time reduce impact on community as best as we can.
And I'll just add to that, Councillor, perhaps I'll be a little more blunt. I don't think so is the answer to your question from my perspective, relatively new at this. But I'm not ready yet to give you a list of the things that I don't have, that we don't have to do this. But what we're presenting today is something that has to be considered in the next week so that we can get ready for what is going to happen at the end of this month in terms of us having to transition based on a high demand from community and the business leaders in Edmonton who have said, we have to change what we're doing this moment. And so this transitions us out, and I think we'll have more answers and more requests coming to council as we look at new innovative approaches, as we look at resources, as we look at the discussion with the province in terms of what they bring to the table. There's a lot more to do here, quite frankly. And this is by no means meant to be sort of the answer to this at all. It's a stopgap measure for now, and we will immediately get to work on the other pieces that are required.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, we do what we can do right now as we work on longer term solutions, but if there are things you need, I hope that list is coming sooner than later, and maybe even broken up into municipal, provincial, federal responsibilities so that we get a clear picture. Because right now, I'm just wondering, do we have any documents that we can digest as a council to understand our responsibilities as a municipality and where the funding gaps might be and where the strategies are, so that we can adequately communicate this to the public instead of making up wild theories and going really extreme with our messaging over something that ultimately we are responsible for.
Councillor, we can take that back. We have a lot of that information that we've used when we've talked to our colleagues in the GOA and the federal government in terms of when we've done advocacy with those agencies in terms of what those requirements for our city are. So we can sort of refine that a little bit and share that with council.
Okay, because I think that's important, because if we're talking about business owners and their frustration, they live in the city, they see this happening on their city streets, so they immediately are going to be upset at the city, whether it's action or inaction or whatever it may be. But a lot of this is really out of our realm. And so if we can't communicate that, then, we're trying to solve people's problems with tools that we just literally don't have at our disposal. And they should know who has those tools and how they can be implemented. I mean, does this make sense to you?
No, totally, Councillor. And certainly, our responsibility as local government, as you've alluded to, in terms of relating that to other seniors' orders of government, I don't think there's a common collective understanding of the clarity between what level of government is responsible for what kind of services in this domain. So putting that on paper for council to use as a resource can certainly go there. Jackie, did you want to jump in any further on that, Jackie or Crystal?
No, I think you covered it, Rob. I think to your point, Councillor, is when you're talking about tools in the toolbox, we're looking at day services. The province is doing overnight services. But I think it's important to recognize that there's a significant number of Edmontonians who are in this population who are living with untreated mental illness and untreated addictions. And at some point, those folks are, you know, they're the ones that we're talking about. If, to Councillor Nichols' point about folks who are disrupting the community, it is difficult. The shelters don't have the tools to deal with that. And there's other tools that belong to other orders of government that do. But at the end of the day, the system right now is not able to manage those folks. And we can't shelter our way through that problem. And we certainly can't enforce our way out of that problem.
Thank you. I'm out of time.
Thank you for self-regulating. Councillor Walters?
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. So a lot of this conversation makes me feel this is the sort of tyranny of powerlessness. You know, we start destroying each other and yelling at each other and blaming each other, and everybody's frustrated. And, you know, we've been very, very frustrated about this, and that's certainly growing. So to that end, Mr. Corbo, maybe as much as you can talk about you referred to some sort of re-engagement administratively with the province around, you know, a pathway here, a strategy here that's more than just us stuck in our, you know, taking a knife to a gunfight circumstance, and kind of broadening the participation of the outcome or the solution we're looking for.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor. I mean, fundamentally, what I'm trying to do is change, at least at the administration level, the dialogue between ourselves and CSS and housing in particular at the province from what I saw to be more of a transactional discussion and now one of more teamwork and collaboration. So to that end, to be very specific, the Deputy Minister of Community and Social Services and I have agreed to essentially co-chair these dialogues so that we're giving our staffs the same guidance and direction. That's only been happening for a couple of weeks right now, but it has resulted, in my perspective, even with another level of data sharing that perhaps may not have been achieved. And I can't really speak to what's happened in the past, but with a Deputy Minister and myself co-chairing a group of folks in terms of you know, sharing the data we have and making sure the province has our full perspective that's backed up with complete data has been a good start, and much of which has resulted, I think, in some ways with some of the solutions that have come to the table with what we're proposing today. But that's the start.
I might offer then, you know, a principle-based approach. You know, I know your job is to give us advice and not the other way around, but I do wonder about, you know, those 4 principles that have been on my mind as I try to zoom out away from the sort of on the ground chaos and anxiety about this challenge is, you know, and Councillor Paquette alluded to it, you know, being very clear about jurisdiction, who's responsible to do what, and who has the tools to do what, that we will enforce our laws because that's what laws are for, is to be enforced, that will protect particularly our downtown as an important part of our COVID recovery, economic recovery.
You're coming to a question, Councillor?
Yes, absolutely. And the last one, which I think is really important, is community-driven advocacy. So it's not just about City Hall and us, you know, municipal councillors fighting with the municipal administrators and then fighting with the province, et cetera, that we need to figure out a way to get the community, the business community and the community at large more involved in that exercise that you described. So how do we do that, Mr. Corbo? How do we engage the community in a way that they can be very expeditiously and directly involved in some of that conversation with the province? So it's not just us.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. I would say, first of all, and I know there's some hesitancy about the effectiveness of the good neighbors community piece, but I think we have to continue to do that. That's part of it. I think the other thing I am doing and we are doing is from a neighborhood and business perspective, we are communicating and having roundtables about, you know, what specific needs need to be addressed which we're actioning. So, 2 weeks ago, we met with BIAs and other folks in the community about what the specific needs were, and 4 days later, we were cleaning back alleys. Now, that's a start, I get it, but we have to, I think the difference from my perspective is we have to talk to the communities and the business partners and everybody and immediately try to react.
Sorry to interrupt, but I mean, picking some of those folks to help with the conversation that's required with the provincial group that you've set up, right? That group you set up with the province. So,
yeah, absolutely.
It is a true statement, and I want you to confirm this or not, if you believe this or not. The municipal toolbox, as it exists today, cannot contend with untreated mental illness and untreated addictions.
No, of course not.
Of course not.
And it's a combination of municipal, provincial, and federal responses
Right.
here in Canada, and absolutely, it's different orders of government, and the municipal government, I think, has the least amount of capacity of all the orders of government to deal with this directly. But we can't not do anything, and that's why we're proposing something here today.
I'm probably out of time.
Thank you. Councillor Henderson, if you could take the chair.
Will do.
Well, it really does feel like we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't. If we open shelters and they have spillover effects, that's our fault. If we don't open shelters but bring to our public the attention that the province isn't opening sufficient shelter space, then we're passing the buck. And if camps form and we don't close them immediately, then we are allowing the disorder from the camps. So it seems to me that we are more or less in a corner at this point, unless there is a way out. I mean, the way out is we open shelters because that, notwithstanding the whole previous line of questioning about all of the limitations and challenges that come with that, your best advice is that is the best mitigation and best management strategy for this massive societal failure to support vulnerable people before a pandemic, only made worse by a pandemic and the economic situation we find ourselves in. Is that fair?
Yes, Mayor, I think that's fair. And what I would also say is when you're in a corner like this, when you've got no perfect answers and not everybody's at the table, you've got no choice but to do the right thing. I think this is the right thing, particularly because we're in the middle of a pandemic. And it might be a different advice we would provide to you, and probably we will once we emerge out of the pandemic. But we can't afford to do nothing in the pandemic. We might be able to afford to do nothing in a different experience outside of a pandemic. And that's for me what is the compelling case for the next 5 months is we've got to get through this pandemic.
Agreed, and there are some additional spaces and capacity gaps being filled when Hope opens, provided the Herb Jameson, that is, in October, provided that meets minimum standards so people will actually use it, which is a big if at this point. But the spaces that we would open, both the day we would support and the overnight that the province, to their credit, is funding, those would constitute safe shelter for people overnight and to some degree during the day.
That's correct, Councillor.
And there would be, will folks in the day programs have access to 3 meals a day?
There will be food services at the day spaces as well.
And so that's one of the municipal costs in the proposal here.
That's correct.
And we'll route folks to provincial treatment, both for rehab and mental health as able. There would be support workers. We'd invite AHS and agencies in there for folks wanting to access or who can be successfully referred to those treatment services.
That is an important point to amplify in terms of the services that will be provided in the day day spaces. That those services will be, other agencies will participate and work with the individuals who are staying there during the daytime. So I think those kind of services and really encouraging people working, depending on their mental health and their issues they're dealing with, that those professionals will be on site and being able to provide those kind of services.
And the shelter providers we're still not in a position to dictate this because we haven't finished our work on municipal regulations for minimum shelter standards. But the expectation, and certainly for Mustard Seed, what I understand they've undertaken is housing supportive approach to shelters, which is to say pathways into housing wherever possible.
That's certainly correct. And those discussions are, you know, we haven't reported back to council on what those standards would or could be, but certainly the discussions that our staff, Crystal and others, have had with the operators in terms of what are those barriers or reasons people are not frequenting the shelters are underway. And so those and the GOA as well, the colleagues we deal with from CSS want to engage our housing staff in terms of when the new facility is stood up downtown, like what are the best operating, you know, procedures for the new facility. So it'll be important that all that work get legs over the next few months.
So I do have great sympathy for Councillor Caterina's concerns and other questions that have been raised about managing spillover effects. And that, I guess, though, that is part of the recommendation for smaller and distributed rather than another large shelter after our experience at Topino Wild. So it is incremental and it is not a perfect answer, but it is an evolution based on what we have learned, what works, what doesn't work from the convention center.
Yeah, that's
fair to say.
That's correct, Mr. Mayor. And certainly well aware this, you know, the Spectrum building, you know, we're, you know, in terms of security and safety of not just the individuals, but also the impact on community. That facility in particular, you know, we're well aware we've got to really work with the operator to ensure that we can make it as least impactful as possible on community.
But it's a building we own that is reasonably centrally located. Right, okay, I'm out of time.
Yeah.
I'll put the recommendation on the
Well,
floor.
I was going to suggest if you wanted, I would be prepared to put the recommendation
Okay,
on the
I'll
floor,
let you do it.
'cause
That's probably easier.
People seem to want to speak to it, and it seems to me that it'd probably be better to get on the floor so they
Sure.
can.
Okay, I'll take the chair back then and go to you for the recommendation, Councillor Henderson.
So I'm prepared to move the recommendation as it stands in the report.
I'll second it.
And then I will also move a second round of questions for the two councillors that I think are still on the board.
Are there more questions, or is everybody on just to speak?
I believe there's questions, but I.
Okay, all right, well, I'll second the
I'm
motion
seeing-
for a second round
Yeah.
and seek unanimous consent. Any objections to another round of questions? Not seeing any. Who's next on the list?
I think it was Councillor McKean.
No,
Councillor,
it's actually Councillor Banga, and then
Oh,
it's
sorry, my
Councillor
mistake.
McKean.
sorry, Councillor Banga, go ahead.
Thank you. I know we talked a lot about tools in the toolbox. I'm going to be just a little bit blunt. Other than, you know, blaming each other or the other levels of the government, is any money is going to be able to solve this issue? And if not, what else we need to do?
I think the long-term plan that council has approved is the solution. I mean, permanent supportive housing where these individuals can live and get the supports that they need to thrive is the end vision. Councilor McKean often brings up Ambrose Place. We just need, as he said before, you know, another handful of those kinds of facilities to provide services to this population. Jackie, anything beyond that? I think that's where we want to go, and and the funding that is being provided to build the ones that are under construction right now is the end state. We just need more dollars to build more of those kinds of facilities in our city for this population.
And I would add, Councillor, that money and resources are important for sure, but we also, I think, have to spend more time, and when I say we, I mean the entire country and all orders of government spend more time talking about the proactive measures, certainly with regards to mental health and addiction and all those things that we are talking a lot about pathways out of poverty and pathways out of homelessness. I think we also need to talk about pathways into poverty and into homeless and how we can prevent those pathways from being effective and for people to following those pathways. And so there's a whole preventive element here that also requires resources and also requires other, considerations.
Okay. So one of our, our jobs is to provide assurance for the people to protect their life and property. In my mind, I think we are concentrating quite a bit on just the people that are vulnerable folks. Yeah, we need to be focusing there. But I think we are forgetting the other end of the equation. Sure, we got good neighbor agreements and those are signed between community organizations, facility operators, but those are the folks in those facilities are not, I don't want to say not normal, but I would say, they are suffering from some kind of illness, mental or addiction. But my main point in asking this question is how do we provide surety to people who are people who are taxpayers and they want to do good for themselves and for the others?
I'll start answering that. I think, Councillor, we're getting to the public safety responsibility that we have. And I don't believe we're forgetting those folks. I think we're addressing that piece with our own enforcement officers and, of course, the enforcement places at EPS. As we've discussed a lot this week, how that's done, there's going to be a lot more dialogue on that. But I don't believe we're forgetting those folks. I think we're dealing with those folks on a daily basis and trying to provide that public safety. And it's a collaboration between city administration, Edmonton Police, the private owners and entities that are also working in that space. And we have to be very proactive and reactive to those situations. And I'm not saying it's perfect, but we are being quite attentive to those pieces and will continue to do so.
Okay, my time is just about up. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Banga. Councillor McKean.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I fear my questions are mostly rhetorical, but I'll ask them anyways and speak to this after. So, Mr. Corbould, you know these systems perhaps better than the rest of us. We have people who are homeless on the streets of Edmonton with severe mental illness. I'll stop there. I won't say severe addiction, but severe mental illness. Why is it not that we would have those folks helped to get to hospitalization where they would get the care they really need? So in other words, why aren't we transferring more of our homeless population to hospital?
I don't know the answer to that, Councillor McKean. I think it's absolutely essential that should happen in the right cases. But I don't know the answer as to why it's not happening in every case. And I don't know if anybody else, Jackie or Crystal, want to add.
Councillor McKean, I think that there is a very significant effort nationally to Mr. Corbell's earlier point, but also at the local level too, to bring together the two systems that are providing care for the population that we're discussing, which is the homeless serving sector and the health sector, and start to talk about how this is really a health-based response in many cases. And so I know AHS has, made some strategic investments into very system level sort of interventions in Edmonton where there's teams that are available and go out on the street. But I don't think anyone would suggest that there's enough of that going on. And so that is a constant source of focus and continuous improvement that we continue to engage at the system level with, like between Homer Trust, AHS, and the city and the province. These conversations are constantly brought up at the Vulnerable People Steering Committee, and we're all sort of working towards that systemic approach, but it's certainly not in place yet.
Yeah, I just think, in several of the councillors' questions today have related about, what authorities and capacities and services we have, none of them being around in any significant way around mental illness or addiction, and whether or not we should then be empathetically and compassionately handing off those folks to the order of government that should really be looking after that. And that would be the provincial government through its psychiatric hospitals and psychiatric wards. Mr. Corbould, is that something that will be discussed?
Yeah, certainly it's on our list of things to discuss with the province. I believe there's a certain amount of that happening now anyways. It may be not to the point we would like, but I do believe in cases it happens. I mean, we hear about it and we know it's happening in some cases. I think the question is how often does it happen and how much access is there to that kind of help for people. So it's certainly on our list of issues.
So when I've talked to quite a few homeless people over the years, and in every case it was very positive. And yet we hear about some real negative behaviors by some minority, I suspect, in the homeless population. And we know that some of them are banned from shelter, evicted, or even completely banned. And does our do our plans post closing the convention center envision a strategy for folks that may be more difficult to deal with and may actually be causing a lot of the issues that Councillor Caterina was having to respond to, and now I'm having to respond to. So I wondered if there's sort of a problematic part of the homeless population that we need to figure out a more comprehensive way to deal with.
I think it's very true that there's a criminal aspect of the community that does find its way into homeless shelters, and that's a real sad fact. And I think the answer to that question is to deal with hardened criminals in the appropriate way. And this gets to Councillor Walter's point in terms of enforcement. Enforcement of criminality needs to be part of this solution, and I think it is. And I think EPS do a fantastic job of doing the intelligence and tracking this criminal element and doing their best to take that out of the equation. And I think it's horrible that a criminal element is exposed to the homeless population who simply need help. So I think enforcement and proper policing with criminals is absolutely essential to this part of the equation.
Thank you. I'm out of time. I'll come around to speak, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor McKean. Councillor Paquette? Or sorry,
Yeah,
Councillor Hamilton is still on the first round, sorry.
Oh, yep, go ahead.
Thank you. I've been listening very closely to this conversation, but something that I'm hearing a lot about from my colleagues is there's a lot of anecdotal stories about the impacts that this is having on communities, and a lot of anecdotal stories about the benefits and of our own strategy. And what I'm, asking in my own mind is, how are we measuring the impact of the work that we're doing in this space? How are we measuring that with the social agencies who are our partners in this?
I really appreciate this question, Councillor Hamilton, because one of the things we discussed this past week with administration is we need to do that better. There is some tracking, and I'll let others speak in a moment, perhaps about some of the stuff we're doing. But as you saw this week with the dashboard we presented on the pandemic and EAC, I've given direction that we create a similar dashboard for this kind of thing, including downtown vibrancy and the specific data as you suggested, that we need to be clear on and hear from, so that it's not anecdotal. So that is a body of work that we are going to start. And I think we have data. I don't think we're showing it to Edmontonians or to council perhaps as much as we should. So we're gonna move on that.
The only other piece just to add, Councillor, is certainly agencies like Homeward Trust and CSS as well, since they're directly funding shelters, do have fairly robust dashboards as well that they share with us. And we've not sort of compiled that in kind of a strategic way to communicate to the public or even ELT. But we get that information internally, but we can certainly take that back and go where the city manager indicated.
Thank you. And I don't expect that you would have this information at your fingertips, but something that I've heard concerns about is consistency of data that we ask for, so that we don't necessarily have a strategy in terms of what specifically we need from every agency that receives funding from the City of Edmonton in terms of what the inputs and outputs are. And I don't know if you could speak to that, Mr. Smythe or Mr. Corbould. Do we have a strategy in terms of what we ask for from the recipients of the funding that we allocate?
I'll just start by saying, Councillor, that needs to be part of the minimum shelter standard from my perspective, and so we're going to work it into there. What we have now, though, I'll just see if Mr. Smythe wants to answer.
Maybe Crystal, do you have any insights on the data piece?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there are system-wide metrics that do exist. Councillor Hamilton and Mr. Smythe mentioned them previously, like around the by names list, which is the most robust by names list in Canada, and it involves over 60 different agencies that feed into that and collect data about the people that are being served and the outcomes that are being achieved. When it comes to the city's contracts specifically, we focus very much on outcomes when we're creating new contracts with agencies. And so, you know, I can give you a bunch of different examples, but with our outreach teams that are in the River Valley, they report to us monthly on how many folks have been engaged for housing, how many are housed, and then provide a wealth of other data too related to just the incidents and the issues that they're seeing. Same thing with Tippinawa. We receive monthly reports that covered all manners of information, including connections to housing, which is obviously the one that we really focus on, but also the number of overdoses prevented, the number of people accessing overdose services or prevention services, as well as the number of meals served, the number of people. There's a lot of different metrics that we track, and also incidents and issues related to safety as well. So, I mean, it continues to be a work in progress, but we do have a number of different performance indicators, both on an individual contract level and a system level, that currently exist and guide the direction of the sector overall going forward.
Thank you. So I guess my last question is for Mr. Corbould. It sounds like this work is coming back soon. Do you have a timeline for when we're going to get more information on this?
The minimum shelter standards work is coming back in June. I think that's when we have to report back to council. And then, of course, there's a whole body of work that's part of the task force recommendations in terms of safe community that we're bringing back in June as well. So I would say a lot of this work will come back in the month of June.
All right, and sort of the larger question about the data that we collect, how we collect it, and the dashboard piece, that's part of that as well?
It is, yes.
All right, thank you. I was toying with the idea of a subsequent motion, but I think it might be more appropriate when we see that information. So thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Paquette.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to Councillor Hamilton for excellent questions. I am going to ask, at what point do we call this what it is? And that is a humanitarian crisis in our streets. Has there been any thought to that? Because we've got a mental health crisis, we've got a housing crisis, we've got a poverty crisis, we've got an addictions crisis, all happening simultaneously on our streets. And if we're not calling it what it is, are we really approaching it in the way that we need to and communicating to the public that this is some serious business? It's not that we're ignoring it, it's that this is a serious problem and we need all hands on deck from all levels of government.
That's a real tough question, Councillor, and my view may be tainted by some of my experiences witnessing and being in the midst of some humanitarian crisis overseas. And with that slant, I guess, of my lived experience, I would say I don't think we're there yet in comparison to some of the post-war conflict scenarios I've been involved in. Now, that may not be a fair comparison because this is a fantastic country in Canada and we should have a better standard anyways. But don't know how we could answer that, but we could go back and think about it a bit. I guess it would be based on some of the humanitarian crisis indicators that are either in the United Nations or nationally, but I could not answer that question today.
Right, and that's a fair point. In the worst places in the world, things are worse, but we are supposed to be one of the best places in the world, and we've got people literally dying on our streets. So people want us to take action. There's no member of the public who's saying ignore this issue. They're saying fix this issue. And I guess my frustration lies in we've got a lot of different plans, but do we have plans to actually solve this issue once and for all, or are our plans just to mitigate this influx that just keeps growing?
Yeah, and I would say, do we declare a humanitarian crisis? I guess my question would be, what does that bring? Does that bring more resources? Does it bring more powers? Does it bring more? And I don't think it does, which is from an administrative perspective, I don't think it helps. So I'm not trying to be, I think it certainly, it's a crisis for many humans, absolutely. And I think we have to acknowledge that. But as an administrator, I would say if that declaration came with millions of dollars and resources that we could then apply to that crisis, I would be absolutely advocating for it. But I don't believe it
And
would.
I guess that's my question. Would it mean an influx? Because, look, I mean, just put everything on the table. Part of what we're seeing here is just a generational impact of genocidal actions. And so this is an ongoing situation that was started over 100 years ago, hundreds of years ago. And we're sitting here trying to pick up these pieces. We're chasing at this and that and just trying to tie off the ends of problems instead of dealing with the root problem. And that's really frustrating to me. And I'm just wondering if there's a response to that.
Well, just that, like you pointed out, we are much further ahead of this than a lot of places in this world because of who this nation is. And so that's a sign of positivity, but we absolutely have to focus on these issues until they're all gone.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and the thing is, it should be made clear that we're all doing our best. We're all trying our best, but at this point, everyone is fed up, and I think there's a public will to do more. So I'll just leave it at that because I want to speak to this. Thank you.
Well, I would agree that we're all trying our best, but I also would agree that we need to try different things. And we are going to try different things. We are now trying different things. Tippinawa was a different thing. Some of these suggestions are different. Some of them are the same. And like we discussed with the encampments, and maybe there's an outdoor living experience that can be provided. That is a new thing we haven't tried. And I think we have to keep on trying different things and new innovative approaches to this. And so I would say we have not exhausted every idea in the world, and we'll continue to try new things.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I think we're speaking to it now. Councillor McKean.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I'm reminded today how much I appreciate my council colleagues and the investments we've made in our own homeless strategy, which I think was unprecedented, certainly in the amount of dollars invested per capita, which we'll start to really see generate positive action with the opening of 5 supportive housing units in early 2022. So, and I wanted to say that I think our administration though getting beat up a bit today out of our own frustration over this, has done amazing work. So I'm reminded of that because I'm demoralized, because of the constant emails and phone calls and criticism I've had to deal with over this. And it gets demoralizing, but I know that other people are demoralized, and I hope our administration doesn't feel that way over the weekend. But there's frontline workers who are out there every day looking after the homeless. They're demoralized. Neighborhoods who have suffered the impacts of social disorder near to the convention center and other shelters, they're demoralized. Business is demoralized. It is so frustrating, and that this is also happening in the midst of a pandemic. So I know that we are doing our best, but like Mr. Corbould just said, I think we still have to look for innovative ways to deal with this. And I think we have to move quickly on issues like mental illness, get people who need treatment, better treatment, and addiction. And as you know, we just passed a motion asking for help on that, which I think would go a long way to reducing the social disorder related to addiction and the crime and petty crime that is associated with that whole realm. I feel really demoralized about this, and I hope that that we can start to deal with the security issues. My questions earlier to Mr. Corbould were serious. We have, I think the majority of our homeless people, and we know this from our own work done through the Recover Initiative, most of them are pleading for engagement or involvement or joining the community and respect. We just want respect. And we want to help. I want to help, and I know all you do by your motions and all the work you've done. You want to help those people. And yet we have some people that are causing a lot of problems. And one of the homelessness causes so much conflict. And we saw this today in our own meeting with some of us being very upset. And the other group that has been demoralized and caught up in this conflict is the Edmonton Police Service. And, throughout the whole Black Lives Matter defund the police thing, I was pulled in two opposite directions. One was absolutely wanting our BIPOC communities to feel absolutely safe in this city. And in the Venn diagram, there's a big overlap between BIPOC people and our homeless people. And that is a sad and tragic truth. But we need the police. We need the police to protect the homeless people who are being preyed upon by other homeless people. We need the police to help communities and businesses deal with this. And I fear that they've been the group that has been most demoralized over the last year. But we need their help. And I know Chief McPhee and his philosophy is to engage with and work with neighborhoods, not to be a top-down military force swooping in and arresting everybody. That's not his philosophy. So I hope we come out of this demoralized situation with a much more positive attitude about working together to solve these confounding historic problems created largely in the 1980s when we closed psychiatric hospitals, but we've never filled that gap. I will support this motion, knowing it's the best we can do right now, and I thank administration for coming up.
Sorry, Councillor, that's your time. Thank you. Councillor Paquette.
Thank you, yes, and I agree with everything my colleague just said, and this makes me think, we know what the solutions are. Our administration, our staff has done incredible work over the years. There's no question in their minds or mine about what needs to be done. But we're in a position where, as a municipality, we've got a gardening spade, just a little hand tool, basically, to try to dig toward those solutions. Meanwhile, we've got other orders of government who have a backhoe that could handle this with minimal effort and almost immediately. And so this is the position we're in. And then we're sitting here in frustration. Our population of the city, both homeless and non-homeless, or houseless anyway, is frustrated. Everyone is frustrated because we don't have the tools to get to those solutions as quickly as we should. And everything that we're doing is stopgap measures. Even our long-term plan depends on other orders of government stepping up. And if anything, this conversation should be a teachable moment for the public to see what the separation of powers are, what the responsibilities are, what budgeting looks like, and why we are where we are. Why we don't have an MSI, why we don't have a charter. People are literally suffering, losing limbs, losing livelihoods and lives on our streets, and it is completely preventable. We're doing our part. I'm going to be supporting this motion, obviously, or this recommendation, because we continue to do our part. But we need serious reflection from other orders of government. As our communities go, our city will go. As cities go, so goes a province, and so goes a nation. The economic impact of these half measures is astounding. Municipalities are the economic engines of this country. And when we have people in our streets, we are impacting the economic activity of our businesses and our neighborhoods. And it becomes a terrible and unsustainable downward spiral. I give full and open kudos and accolades to an administration who is trying to do with $1 things that require $10 or $100 or $1,000. Budgets that are simply out of reach for any municipality, but simply within reach for a provincial government. And that's where it is. And if anyone in the public is paying attention to this, understand that. We have issues here that have been downloaded onto our shoulders as a city that are not our responsibility or within our tools or finances to take care of, yet we're being asked to take care of. And because we do not have these, we cannot deal with it in an effective manner, the way that it should be done. I hope the public understands this. And I don't know what the goal is for that. I don't know if it's ignorance of how to proceed. I don't know if it's intentional. I don't know if it's intended to turn people against their own local government. I don't know. But here we are as a municipality dealing with issues that are outside of our jurisdiction because no one else will. And that is absolutely unacceptable. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Banga?
Thank you. I think I share the frustration of all my colleagues. Damned if we do, damned if we don't. I am frustrated to nth degree of frustration. And I am not even sure the current way of our proceeding with the tools we have and the efforts. Are we trying to get in the right direction? And if we are making any permanent fixes, we're doing a lot of patchwork. I see we are trying to extinguish a lot of small fires here and there, but are we really doing something to eliminate these issues? I don't know. I would be pretty suspect at this point. Again, I know my office had a lot of emails. I personally had some phone calls, etc. I know this is not being discussed here, defunding the police and whatnot. But I don't know where people get the idea from that we are asking for defunding the police. However, I want to state that we, like everybody else, are looking for solutions. We want to make sure that we are able to provide the citizens of the city assurance for the safety of their lives and property. That includes everybody. I do want to appreciate administration's extreme hard work under extreme difficult and challenging situation and circumstances. And I don't know if we are really doing any favor to ourselves by shifting the blame to one or another. However, we are all frustrated. I think it's understandable. And I would be supporting this motion, even though I see at this point in time that it's still a patchwork solution. But I don't see no other way around it. It has to be done. And so at this point in time, I'll be supporting the motion. But I hope that all of us somehow come to some kind of resolution where we all agree that we're going to do our society a favor. Sure, we can issue a lot of slogans and promises, but we need to actually do something for everybody. And that's my take on it. And I will, like everybody else, I'm extremely frustrated, but this is what we got in front of us, and I fully support it. Thanks.
Thank you. Next is Councillor Zadek.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Great conversation today on a very tough topic. I always learn a lot from my colleagues, not just today, but over a year plus, 3.5 years even, on this topic. So I'm frustrated with it, but we got to keep trying, and I appreciate new ideas being brought to the table. I'll be the first to admit that homelessness issues are not in my face here in Ward 3, even though a lot of folks are 1 to 2 paychecks away from being homeless, but it hasn't presented itself in the type of way that we see in other parts of the city. So I have a lot of sympathy for my fellow councillors that share their experiences. And for that reason, I'm happy to dedicate the resources required as we poke around at what might work and what might not work, and agreeing with others that this is patchwork and that's not the right approach either. For those that know me, know I don't like to get too involved into other levels of government's jurisdiction, partly for the reason that I don't want them getting involved in our level of government's jurisdiction. But when you're dealing with human lives and such a serious issue that is borderline or is a crisis, I'm not trying to parse words or anything. It's a huge crisis. So I support this motion. I know time's tight today, but I wanted to weigh in because I've mostly been listening because it's largely not a Ward 3 issue, but it's a City of Edmonton issue. So I just wanted to be on the record with that and happy to support this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Zadick. Councillor Knack?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I mean, I feel like I don't have a ton to add, but I feel it's still important to speak to this and offer just a few additional thoughts. So I really appreciated Councillor Walter's comments when he jumped in and just to remind us all that, I think the frustration we're all experiencing between each other, through the questions, there is a bit of a feeling of helplessness because, in fact, our city administration is doing everything humanly possible to try to support people who are experiencing homelessness right now. And there are challenges that come up, but they're working tirelessly, well outside our jurisdiction to try to help make the best of a really challenging situation. So just to first say my thanks to everyone who is doing this work every day, trying to make the best of it. And yeah, there are a number of issues, and we've heard from some of the ward councillors in particular most impacted about some of those real issues that are happening. And I don't believe any of those are due to a lack of effort from the people who are working each and every day on this. And I appreciate Councillor Banger's point around, is it worth really getting into whose responsibility it is? And honestly, in this case, it really is. And I know we've talked about it before, but I cannot, for the life of me, understand why no provincial government has cared about helping people who are experiencing homelessness for the last couple of decades. This isn't just this provincial government. And to be clear, it's not the provincial administration and staff who work in those areas. It's the people who actually have the ability to bring about the change that we need. They don't care. I don't understand it. I wish even just they would have a public conversation like we do seemingly every month now, that Albertans could hear and actually hear their elected representatives say, this is an issue that's important, and here's how we're actually going to deal with it. But they don't. So that's where my frustration is. And I don't know how to solve it because we've gotten to the point, and I find it when I go and engage with people, that people think this has become a municipal responsibility because we've just tried to help human beings as best we can. And I appreciate Mr. Corbold's comment earlier of we can't afford to do nothing. He said those words, and of course we can't, because the alternative is far, far worse. But it just continues to blow my mind that provincial government after provincial government after, this is not a partisan issue, this has been existed across party lines for as longer than I've been on council, that's for sure. But I've had the opportunity to experience 3 different provincial governments, none of who have ever done anything. Sure, they've funded one housing development here, one there, and oh great, we did it. We've built some units, but they actually haven't done anything on this, and that's what's just so very frustrating because they could solve it. We're spending the amount of money we have to spend to recover through this pandemic. One of the easiest things for every person to support, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, is that everyone could have a home. I'm okay with a deficit if it means building a home for everyone. But I don't get why it's not happening. So obviously I'll support this, but maybe one day anyone in the province will actually do their job.
Thank you, Councillor Knack. Councillor Essinger?
Thank you. And it's been an interesting conversation this morning, and I think we're feeling frustrated because we care. We care about the people experiencing homelessness. We care about the impact on neighborhoods. We care about how it affects our city. regardless of whose responsibility is, these are people that we care about. So because of that, I'm going to support this motion. I think even though we may not see homelessness in every ward, I think it's there. I see pockets of small camps and people all over the place in my ward. So I think it might not be as visible, but it's there. The most important thing is these are people that have challenges and we need to support them. COVID has highlighted the need for more attention, and we are responding the best way we can. So I really appreciate that all the people that brought this forward. It may not be ideal, but it is what we have right now. So thank you very much to everyone who's worked on this file. Thank you.
Thank you. Is Councillor McKean still the deputy for this meeting continuing? Councillor McKean, if you could take the chair.
Take the chair.
Thank you. So I unsurprisingly share.
Sorry, just to be clear, it's actually Councillor Nicol because the revised schedule was approved on Monday and it was effective on the 7th.
I thought it followed the meeting, but then.
That's okay. I'm willing to share with Councillor McKean.
So
I'll take the.
Go ahead, Councillor Nicol, take the chair. Thank you. So unsurprisingly, I share so much of this frustration that we've heard from one another this morning. But I also love hearing the empathy and the compassion for our struggling community members, both from our staff here at the city and I'm sure from our agency partners who are doing this work, and from many, though not all, members of council. I have to say, I am disheartened by some of the judgment and othering of vulnerable people in very difficult circumstances that we've heard today. But I understand we are also hearing that from an increasingly frustrated public and business community that sees social disorder issues on their doorsteps, residential and commercial, and is demanding that something be done. And so I think we have to keep an eye on the big picture here. You know, in the third wave of tiring and vexing and taxing pandemic, the big picture is what it was before, though the challenge is more complex in some ways and deeper in some ways than it was before the pandemic. We have housed more than 12,000 people using Housing First since we adopted the original approach to ending homelessness and that goal. We've housed, and I mean our agencies and our community, not the City of Edmonton alone, but we've played a role, but the agencies have housed 1,300 people since the beginning of this pandemic. Those are the people who are not on the streets right now and not causing social disorder because they got the supports that they needed. That is the prize that we need to keep our eye on. And I really appreciate a number of the questions today about managing the spillover effects. Those are very valid questions. The issues raised today and principles and questions around jurisdictional clarity. I continue to beat that drum even though people say, well, that's just the mayor passing the buck. Why didn't he just do it? Well, with 8 cents of your tax dollar and without the jurisdiction, we're already carrying way more of the water on this than we should be. And this $8 million additional box of Band-Aids is us doing even more. Because it's the right thing to do. Because we are in some kind of crisis. I don't know what adjective to put on it, but it is a crisis, and it has been for years. For many of the long-term structural reasons that we've heard about articulated today, from changes to mental health policy and community living, and the closure of institutionalization, which I think was probably the right move, but the supportive housing that people needed to graduate into wasn't built. And we've known that's the answer for more than a decade, and every time we build it, it works, and it gets better results for taxpayers and for vulnerable people and for their families, so that those folks who are struggling aren't a burden on community or on families who are bearing an unacceptable burden right now. And when those families give up and those houses break, people wind up on the street and they wind up drawing immensely on the criminal justice system, on the healthcare system, on our police, on our agencies, and on our main streets. So we know that the answer is housing first. And so I really appreciated Councillor Knack's question about should we be buying, even if it's just a few, should we be spending this money on the cure, which is housing units and rapid housing, rather than on shelter and mitigation, or as I've referred to them, Band-Aids. And it's, you know, the new analogy might be, do we want more vaccine or do we want more masks? It feels like today we're buying $8 million more masks, but it's not our job to buy the vaccine in this case, to buy the cure to this scourge. It is, and thanks to the federal government's rapid housing initiative, we have more than $40 million in the construction jobs to go with it to deliver over 200 units of precisely the kind of housing that these vulnerable folks need. The other $68 million in applications that we put in were turned down because the government of Alberta will not fund the Lights On funding. That's more than 400 units of housing we could have built this year, and COVID construction jobs that were leaving by the wayside because of the inaction of the government of Alberta. That's why we're here, and we shouldn't be. But in spite of all that, I am going to support this recommendation because it's the humanitarian thing to do. I'll take the chair back and go to Councillor Henderson. Oh, sorry, Councillor Caterina before Councillor Henderson to close.
I'll be extremely quick, Mr. Mayor. Thank you. Everybody understands my feelings prior to this. So the compassion is still there, and from my perspective and the citizens of Ward 7 and the communities that have been affected over and over and over again, they've welcomed being helpful to this point. So all I ask really at the end of the day is that we put a more balanced effort into supporting certainly those that are vulnerable, and a similar effort in supporting the neighborhoods that welcome them in providing that support. What I've experienced from the last number of stand-ups that we've had, you know, as I mentioned the Expo Center, certainly I think we need a little more balance on the social disorder side and to help the neighborhood. I'm not saying that it has to be 50-50 given the circumstances, but it can't all be one-sided where we forget about the actual neighborhoods in the attempt to help the those vulnerable populations, which we all want to help. And I didn't want anybody to think that that's not the case for Ward 7 or downtown, and that everybody's trying their best. But at some point in time, there has to be a little more effort made on the efforts made to support neighborhoods, citizens, businesses, BIs, whatever it happens to be. It has to be a little closer to balance than I see it at this point right now. And that's maybe out of necessity because the effort is on to for this particular population and given the pandemic and so forth. And I understand that. But again, this is not this year's problem or last year's problem. This has been an ongoing problem that we really need to be compassionate as well to the neighborhoods and the constituents of Edmonton that are affected in a different way than the vulnerable people are. They deserve the same sort of consideration. So with that, I will be supporting this. I would have supported it from the beginning, but an opportunity to vet a little bit certainly has helped me.
I hear you, Councillor. Thank you. Anybody else before I go to Councillor Henderson to close? Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat a lot of what's been said. I think it is worth noting that we know what the solutions are. We've known for 11, 12 years since we got our homeless report what the solutions were. And if we'd started on some of this then, we wouldn't be in this boat. We knew 5 years ago when we went back against that report what the gaps were. And if we'd started on it then, we wouldn't have this issue, but we haven't been able to get anybody else to come to the table, and I think we've heard that. Those options are not going to solve our problem this summer. They're not going to solve our problem in the short term. They're longer term solutions, and even if we stepped up to them today, which I think we are now doing, they're not going to fix what we're facing now. So we don't have the real option available to us. What we have is an imperfect, temporary solution that hopefully will be the best we can do to get ourselves through this summer. It will be imperfect. There will be problems that go with it. I don't think we can kid ourselves about that. And we have to keep on trying to adapt to come up with the best Band-Aid we can to mitigate those concerns, to make sure that everybody is taken care of, and to make sure that we don't destabilize ourselves in other kinds of ways. And I think we've heard that today. But I think we'd be kidding ourselves if we thought this was going to be perfect, and this is a perfect solution, even with what's being put on the table. So we're going to have to continue to adapt and adjust and trying to do the best we can with an imperfect situation. We know what happens from previous years if we do nothing. It doesn't make it any better, it makes it worse. And I think the same is true. A lot of people would like us to see come in with more draconian responses. All that does is push it around, and again, I think probably makes the problem worse rather than making it better. I really think that any real response is questionably legal to begin with, and is certainly immoral. So I don't think those options are really available to us. So I'm appreciative of what's being brought forward to us today in the short term, which I think are the best solutions we have in order to make sure that we can deal with our entire population in a humane way, in one that allows people to survive this next few months in the best possible way and allows our communities to stay as strong as they possibly can. Is it going to be perfect? Are we going to be able to achieve all of that? I don't think we will, and I think we're going to have to continue to be able to adjust and adapt, to Councillor Caterina's point, to what actually comes in front of us. I think this is the best option that we have right now. And I really appreciate the work that administration has done to continue to refine our response, imperfect as it is, given the situation that we have, that we can only do a short-term response. The long-term response is still months and months and months away. Thanks to the City Council and some of our decisions, it's now underway in a way that it wasn't even a year or two ago. But it's not going to get us through this summer. So I support this, understanding that probably this will come back to us, that we'll probably have to respond to the pressure points that will inevitably come up with this. I think it's the best solution that's available to us, and I really appreciate the kind of work that has gone into continually to adapt to try and get the best answer that we have available to us at this time, which I believe is what's being put on the table in front of us today, which is why I moved it and will continue to support it.
Thank you. I'm going to ask for a roll call vote. Councillor Banga?
I'm present, Mr. Mayor.
And are you in favor or opposed?
I am in favor.
Thank you. Councillor Cartmel?
Yes.
Thank you. Councillor Caterina?
Yes.
Thank you. Councillor Zadig?
In favor.
Thank you. Councillor Essinger?
Yes.
Thank you. Councillor Hamilton?
Yes.
Thank you. Councillor Henderson?
Yes.
Thank you. Councillor Knack?
Yes.
Thank you. Councillor McKean?
Yes.
Thank you. Councillor Nickel?
Yes.
Thank you. Councillor Paquette?
Yes.
Thank you. Councillor Walters?
Yes.
That's unanimous. Thank you. We have an agenda management, I was going to say crisis, but that would be overstating it, challenge before us here. We can deal with at least some business, likely at 2:30 today. We can have not full attendance, but sufficient. So and we may juggle the order of the agenda at that time around availability for folks and postpone that 192 to a different time. But just so that we don't mile out here in the next 5 minutes, can I get a motion to continue from 2:30 to 5:30?
So moved.
To complete the agenda. Thank you, Councillor Henderson. Seconded by Councillor McKean. Please.
Well, Mr. Mayor, I cannot make it this afternoon, unfortunately, so be aware. Thank you.
Okay.
Same with me, Don. For part of it, I could be there for the later portion.
Okay, and I've heard from at least a couple of other members of council that they can't, so I wasn't aware of you two, so I think we may start to then have a quorum issue.
I have 9, Mr. Mayor.
and a fairness issue. So I'm going to suggest then that instead of continuing this afternoon, that we look at Tuesday next week. That should be in your calendars still. So I'm going to suggest 1:30, and then we'll get as far as we can with that. We may also need some of Tuesday for exec, but we can work around it. But so Councillor Henderson has had to run out, but I'm going to see if there's any objection to, or I think the cleanest thing to do is to amend his motion to say instead reconvene Tuesday at 1:30 p.m.
Mr. Mayor, can I ask a question, please? Executive is on Monday next week.
Urban planning's been
on
canceled.
Tuesday. So
yeah,
looking at those agendas.
Urban planning has nothing on it, so it's been canceled. We're holding Tuesday for exec overflow, but we may need to use some of it for council overflow is the rationale for
so
Tuesday.
that's the executive part that comes in, is the overflow part of it. Okay. All right, thank you.
So hold all of your Tuesday, please, for a mixture of exec overflow and whatever we want to determine today. My recommendation is 1:30 p.m. continuation of this meeting. Someone want to move that?
I'll move that.
Second.
Thank you, Councillor Knack, seconded by Councillor Banga. Okay, that's the amendment.
Point of privilege.
Yes, Councillor McKean?
Sorry. So 1:30 Tuesday, are you proposing anything for this afternoon?
No, because I don't think we'll have enough people to work through some of the complex items, so. So I'm saying in lieu of this afternoon, because of what we've heard about absences, that we take Tuesday afternoon instead.
Thank you.
So strictly speaking, Councillor Henderson's motion is on the floor, but he had to run out to the same thing I'm going to be late for. So what's before us now is an amendment to his original motion, which substitutes Tuesday afternoon for this afternoon. So I need to vote on that amendment first. Please vote.
Do you need a seconder?
No, it's already seconded. Thanks.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor Zadok.
Yes.
Thank you. I have all the votes except for one.
Mine's not coming up. I'm a yes.
Okay, we have all the votes, Mr. Mayor.
It's trying to print an agenda for me right now. So display the vote, please, on the amendment. That's carried on the motion as amended. Please vote.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, councillors.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Walters, we are good to go.
Display the vote, please. That's carried. I'll call orders now, and we will continue this meeting at 1:30 on Tuesday. Thank you.
Mr. Smythe, are you still on the call?